isolated four walls of the studio. It's actually made in the context of what is happening around, whether it's the gallery context, whether it's public art, community, conversations with other artists. But ultimately, you want to put something out into the world. This was another way of doing that, a much more direct way, because now you can comment upon it directly to me. Change the nature of what I'm doing because it's an opportunity that I've been looking towards for some time, and now it happened. So I'm very grateful. Thank you, Billur.
It's also wonderful that this work, maybe it was going to be built without being seen, but now it has also a much special, I think, place in the exhibition. So it will be placed in the exhibition, and it will be on view until the end of the exhibition. So that's a wonderful thing. Thank you for being here, I think. And thank you for carrying your studio from London to Istanbul.
My pleasure.
Also.
Yeah.
I was also wondering about the use of the repurposed sheet aluminum as the main material in the art making process. How do you feel about turning waste material into an artwork? And it's actually a material that's a byproduct by nature. It's not used aesthetically. It's used to provide something aesthetical. But now it has become an aesthetical object on its own, and it's on view now.
That's right.
Instead of being thrown away.
Yeah.
So that's a wonderful contribution, I think, and it's a wonderful example. Thank you. Let us hear about what you think.
You may or may not be familiar with the mechanized reprographic process, what used to be called the full color separation. So magazines and newspapers were printed using lithographic plates, which were inked, and then they're put through a press, and paper rolls over them, and boom, 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 hundreds, thousands of copies can happen. The plates can be worked on, they were originally stones, but then they became these very thin aluminium sheets. You can work on them by hand, but in terms of modern reprographics, it would be photographically derived, so the text and the illustrations we see in printed media. The material I'm using was from a stack of used lithographic plates, so they have images on them. They've been inked, they've been used to print material, but the plates don't have any real purpose afterwards. Sometimes they are stripped off and reused, but the material is so cheap, it's essentially what we think of as disposable. But we know, of course, that very few things are disposable. Material has to go somewhere. And whether it's in a landfill, or whether it's melted down and used to create something, another object. In this case, I didn't have to melt that down. I could cut through it. The reason I choose that material is because of its malleability. You can cut through it with heavy-duty scissors. You can push and pull by hand. And I was thinking about an American artist called John Chamberlain, whose work you may or may not know, and he's very well known for creating sculpture from crushed auto parts. But in order to do that, let me bring a few down. In order to make the work that he makes, he requires heavy-duty equipment. In order to crush that metal, because it's auto steel, you'd need car crushing equipment, or you'd need to apply pressure, which is way beyond what we can do with our own physical bodies. And so it's a rather beautiful work, just using the galvanized surface of the metal as if it's graphite or pencil, the coloration. And I wanted to do something I wanted to be able to make something in the studio with a similar aesthetic, because I'm interested in I'm interested in processes that have been developed within art making. And they're things that we can dip into. They don't have to be entirely unique. In fact, so for example, if one artist is using oil paint and another artist uses oil paint, then we don't say to the second artist, why did you copy that artist for using oil paint? Because it's a material. Now you could say that once that material is manipulated in a certain way, certain imagery, language, then, okay, there can be plagiarism. One person is copying the other. But then we get into the realm of broadly speaking, postmodernist thinking, where style and language is all around us. And we can, if you choose to, you can pick and claim techniques and iconography and motifs, and it's the placing together of those within the context of where we are now in time and space and culture that allows new statements, essentially, or you create kind of reverberations or vibrations within work. And so this method, if you like, of taking forms, I'm looking for a painting by Picasso. Here's a painting by Picasso. This is the one I want. So this is a painting from 1945 called Skull with Leaks. And Picasso's partner at the time, Francoise, asked him why he was painting leaks underneath the skull. And he's quoted as saying something along the lines of, well, I can't go on painting crossbones. They seem a bit kind of predictable. So I thought the leaks would stand in for the crossbones. So the crossed over leaks, because this is painted in 1945, the end of the war, I felt that the angular nature of the leaks was somewhat reminiscent of the detritus of war, the leftover, the broken shards of metal or artillery casings. And in my mind, I saw the post-war gesture of John Chamberlain crushing the American auto parts and the 1945, where do we go after war, after Second World War, as being somehow, in my mind, they were together. They overlap.
Juxtaposed almost.
Yes. And I was making this form. I was using that still life form and quoting from it, essentially. And then I hit upon the idea of making an aluminium sculpture using the same material of those leaks as a form in the studio. I then photographed that sculpture and then using another 20th century technique of contemporary art, I screen printed an image of the sculpture onto a very large photographic and digital painting. So I know that I'm kind of skipping ahead various processes, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that the reusing, if you like, reusing of the aluminium material, reusing of language, reusing of action and process. I think we create originality through the ways in which we form links between language and materiality and other people's thought as well as our own thought. They're almost entirely smooth, and there's a very small differentiation between parts. And it's taken me many years to find a way of bringing the material together in that kind of way, with a certain level of slickness. Because prior to this, my technique was more, it was either very photographic or it was very painting. And it's only the last 2 or 3 years that I've managed to bring these together, I would say.
I think it was also a wonderful study. I really liked the passage and the liaison, the communicate, the dialogue between them. I think it's so precious.
Thank you.
Sorry, I had to go for...
All right, is he okay?
He's okay. He's got a little thing on his
no.
nose, but yeah. So
Oh.
Can we then say that the performance act as a deconstruction of our own ideas, in a way, this is what we also see in the images you've just shown, about stability within the art-making process, and if so, in which way? And maybe also we could also talk, while talking about this, a bit about the work you have produced here, and you've already talked about it just a bit, but the name you've given it, Untitled, and in parentheses, Zot.
Zot, yeah.
Yes, that's an interesting, and the reference would be interesting, I think.
So this sculpture is actually, well, okay, I'll start with, for around 10 years or more, I have tended to name works Untitled, and then in brackets next to that, there's another title. But I don't want to be so specific. So for example, if I called this sculpture Zot, it's called Zot. It's like naming a cat. You know, there it is. That's the name of the cat. But if you named your cat Untitled and then a name, it indicates that it's not that you're unsure, but you're giving some possibility, some space for other things to happen. So this work is Untitled Zot, and it's actually number 2, because there's an original Zot that I was telling you about, the first sculpture. Now this leads me to ZOT is Dutch for crazy or fool. And the American painter, who you're probably aware of, Willem de Kooning, abstract expressionist painter, he made a series of works in the late 40s. And there's the word Zot at the bottom, and he was Dutch, and he emigrated to the US.
So in a way, it's giving it its own individuality.
Through expressing its craziness.
Yes.
I like the idea of calling the work an idiot. It's because the implication is that, well, I made it, so I can't exactly blame the work. And there's this, it came about in part because I'd created this top part of the sculpture, which I felt was like a Z. And then below that, there's a kind of belly almost, like a round form, which has a space that you go through. And I was thinking about, modernism and I've gone the wrong one. Barbara Hepworth. This is a watercolor of mine made. It represents a sculpture by Barbara Hepworth, so it's my image of it. And we could say that it represents a kind of infinity, this oval, something to pass through. And the sculpture that I made outside, and I'll show you the first version of it. And then it appears in other pictures as well, you see. But I'll show you the first version. Zot, here we go. So, this is from an exhibition last autumn. So the first version has this top part that appears as if it might relate to a Z or a kind of flash or gesture. And it's got this O or oval-like. And because of the nature of my mind anyway, that was enough for me to think, I believe there's a connection between de Kooning's reference to a kind of nihilistic post-war sensibility that art making is crazy, black and white artwork is crazy, what is he doing in America, will he ever make it? Of course he did. And those suggestions. Now, I think what I'm trying to say is that references, you hope that references coalesce in such a way that they are just evident within the work. I don't particularly want to spell things out in a kind of ABC manner. I think that work should contain your thinking. And yes, you could explain, as I am now, you can explain, but on a kind of phenomenological level, as a viewer, you're also coming to things just as they are, as objects in the world, in the same way that my works, large works on canvas, appear to be paintings. And they are paintings, but they're also photographic, digital representations of paintings that I've made. They're also representations of constructions in the studio, and they're also printed in a mechanical way. And those complexities are what I want to set up for the viewers, so that in order to navigate that physicality, you need to think about what it is you're looking at, in the same way that I'm thinking about what it is I'm making, basically. So I'm trying to pass on part of that experience. All of this essentially turns towards a kind of deconstructionist attitude, which is essentially where I come from, I would say, in my thinking. And so although there may be a large, seem to be a distance between these two ways of working. And in fact, there's 24 years between the two.
But I still see the resemblances.
I think so. I think
Yes.
in terms of the way in which I make links between action and pictorial form. And one of the advancements for me has been taking more control of the action or the verb, and thinking about, more specifically, about how it is that I work, and trying to make that a more active part of the artwork itself, I would say.
And your presence, I think, is always felt. The fact that it's also staged photography goes so well with the theme of the exhibition, doesn't it?
It does. I was, let me say, more than pleasantly surprised to find out that you'd called the show staged.
Yeah.
I would say that the majority of what I have been doing in the studio, in various studios over the years, has involved an aspect of construction. So creating a space within my studio in which I believe that certain things are more possible. And by that I mean that I could construct certain things if I changed the inside of the studio in a certain way. Also that I can change the way that I work. I can adopt techniques which I've essentially borrowed, but then they can become mine. But they can become mine in part because I'm allowing myself to become an actor in some ways. Now so yes, I'm always present, but at the same time I'm not entirely convinced by an idea of originality being inherent within the individual artist. I think that for me anyway, there's a level of doubtfulness about the validity of our kind of subjective response to the world. And so I try to build in some kind of instability or fluidity of meaning and content, I would say. I still carry on. It's not that I stop, but I'm trying to build into the work an awareness of the non-fixed nature of it. So I could say that I'm using the language of fixedness, the way that we make things that resemble art, But I'm using that language to make things that take apart some of that stability and give you things which are a little more fluid. But it's taken years of experimentation,
Consideration.
some success, sometimes experiencing disillusion over the result. And it's sometimes the case that other people like what you made, but if you don't believe in it, then you continue to essentially put your hands into your own language and start to take it apart again. I think I go through cycles. At the end of each cycle, I find myself deconstructing the language that I put together.
That's very brave, I think. Not many people can do this. It's like confronting yourself in a way and reevaluating.
I think it brings you, for me anyway, it brings me closer to what I might have to say that could be of any importance whatsoever. And we've spoken before about an aim to add something to a conversation. And I honestly don't mean to sound pretentious if I say that if through reading and looking you have a sense of the thinking and making that happened hundreds or several thousand years ago, and you're trying over the years to learn as much about the parts of all that making and thinking as you can to create a web of, well, what interests me and why? And also, how do you place yourself in that web so that perhaps you might have something to contribute? And I believe it's only through an awareness of as much of what has happened as you can wrap your mind around. And also to appreciate what is happening now and where advancements are in thought. And I'm talking also about scientific thought, theories of time, relationship between time and space. And one doesn't have to be an expert. I don't think many artists are, to be honest. I think what we do is we're receptive to various areas of information. And you want to do something useful with that, basically, I would say.
I also like the fact that you create this being, in a way, I think, because it started as I think, drawing and a painting, and then it became a three-dimensional physical thing. And then I keep seeing it it's always there with you. It's maybe a part of you. In surrealism, some of the surrealist painters would refer to the figures in their works as being personages of a person, essentially. And I have this feeling that with the sculpture Zot, with the first one and now with the second one, more than a visitor, like a participant in my studio. So I have the first one in my studio and I kept it there because I wanted to photograph the sculpture and incorporate it into other works. And I could show you what happened to... This is how we met.
This is how we met. This work was purchased in an auction at Christie's in London. And you can tell the story if you want, Billur, because...
No, you tell it better.
So you, at the time though, you were working...
Yes.
At
the Aegis Museum.
Yes.
I was the director of the Aegis Museum. And I had curated a show with this work in it. And I wanted to contact all the artists to tell them about being in the show and invite them over to see the show and everything. So I wrote a message to Paul, 2012 or so, I think, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
So then I got a response that said, well, maybe I might come to Istanbul to see the show. So he did. But I think this work you should talk about. I think it's a very important work.
History forms a part of my work, as you can no doubt gather by now. And sometimes historical elements are referenced in a more specific way. Sometimes they're part of my motivation for making a work. Then they disappear into the work. You don't necessarily have to know all the specifics. But I'm going to tell you about this work, which it was made for it was part of a group of 15 works, and I showed them at a gallery called Marlborough Gallery in London, and in 2007. The catalogue for the show is in the library.
It's right here, actually.
It's right here.
Yes.
Okay. And so I made this group of works which were concerned with the acts of exploitation and plunder, and on the one hand, by the Western avant-garde during the 20th century. So to be more specific, Picasso looks at sculpture, Iberian sculpture. He looks at sculpture from the African continent and incorporates that into the Western avant-garde. But more specifically, I was interested in the way in which the British Empire aggressively pursued their trade routes through the 18th century. Now, to kind of skip ahead slightly, the British East India Company was trading during the 1700s. And in order to continue trading British textiles and machinery to India, Indian opium and cotton to China, and Chinese tea to Britain, they went to war in a series of wars called the Opium Wars to defend their right to ship Indian opium to China. So they were essentially drug runners. And I mean, I don't want to sound moralistic, but I do think it's quite difficult to think about the ways in which governments were able to function. And I think the exploitation of individuals, groups, communities, and whole nations, one group exploiting another. I think thinking about the show upstairs, what it is we take in order to have the things that we have. It's a very simple dynamic, and it can be an incredibly destructive dynamic. Now, the legacy of the East India Company in the 1700s stretched into the 1970s. So it hundreds of years, and specifically in 1972, Idi Amin expelled all Indians and Pakistanis from Uganda who held British passports. Now the link is that those individuals were the third generation of workers to labor on the railways, and they had descended from the individuals who were brought to Uganda by the British colonial administration. And the funds, the money that was being raised through the East India Company was then sent back to Britain, back to the UK, and used to finance the Industrial Revolution, the advancement of one nation at the peril and the demise of another. And I made this work as you could say, as a kind of homage to an individual who happens to be an actor and a writer and lived in East London. But she's playing the part of an individual who was obscured by notions of progress. So in simple terms, I decided to, at the moment just before I pressed the shutter on the camera, I used a theatrical smoke machine to create a plume of smoke that would engulf her. And I did this over and over again until I'd found the image that had what I thought were the right shapes, the right forms to create something that was slightly ambiguous. Is it a magic trick? Am I trying to stop you from seeing her? Is she complicit? Is it a portrait if the face is partly obscured? And I titled it, and there are no brackets here, but I titled it Portrait in Smoke and Steam to make reference to the East India Company, the movement of people from one nation to another to build railways, and the idea of movement and progress, basically.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, going back to the progress of the artworks from to today,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah.
Would you like to also show the following
Which one?
images to?
Yeah. Which one would you? Where would you suggest? Backwards or forwards? What do you think?
I think the ones where the image becomes more abstracted, but it's still, you can feel the spatiality and also the abstraction.
So this is a painting this is Still Life with Goldfish Bowl by Matisse from, I think, 1914 maybe. And I think in certain ways, even when I'm using a human figure as a subject, my work has a relationship to still life. I think there's an idea of almost everything in the work being a framework or a diagram for something that's about to happen. And still life is very much about it. I mean, the clue's in the title, still life. And Matisse was an incredible painter, and he was able to imbue ordinary objects with this sense of solidity, while at the same time there's an idea of, or an indication that things are floating in front of us, that forms and marks could become independent. And that is in essence what led him to move closer to abstraction, and for figuration and abstraction to become really two sides of the coin within his practice. This stool, the daybed behind, the board, the table, just these simple forms created a language that I then painted onto a three-dimensional screen that I'd made in the studio. And this was the beginning of a long series of works in which the figure is no longer present. The figure becomes you. You are the figurative part is you, the viewer, approaching the objects and the representations in the picture, and the picture itself is an object. And so we're getting much closer to what was happening when you were viewing this live studio, is that you are the sentient, the thinking subject. And you're looking at objects in the same way that you were looking at me making an object. The uprightness, the verticality of the screens created a kind of stand-in for the figure. And so in my mind, having one vertical and one horizontal, it's as though one object is bearing witness to another, or the relationship between those. So there's a further paring down of compositional relationships and What would one say? What would one say? I know. If we go back in our minds to the figure of the Lamentation of Christ and my work with the man on his back and the woman next to him, with her back turned to him. In my thinking, this is not dissimilar to that. It's just it's another way of describing those relationships. And it makes reference to them in a different, yes, it makes reference to other types of language. But we have access to all of that. And we can say things in different ways which may be more relevant at any one time. And this is partly what I'm talking about when I mention trying to add something to the web of meaning and communication.
What is wonderful about these works is I think you include so many things in there. Things you make, things that are already in existence, and the relation you create between them. I think it's really impressive. It takes a while to understand, to grasp, but...
Well, they're physical spaces that sometimes contain sculptural objects, and they're built kind of life-size, if you like, in front of a camera, but they're only built, unlike Zot 2 outside, which will survive. Most of the objects that I make and paint on and light in a certain way and photograph and then make paintings of and photograph the paintings and digitally bring those into the photographic material and print them, etc. Most of the objects are destroyed after they're modified, so they don't survive for more than one or two pieces. So there's constant evolution of generating objects and then manipulating them, reusing them, recycling them. If I didn't do that, I would be living in a space that just had so many objects in it, and there'd be no room for me. So, yeah. So adaptability is very important. So given the scale of the works themselves. So the first version of Zot appears in a painting, a work on canvas, partly painted, partly printed. And I've started to do something with the canvases in which I pull them apart. So rather than have the painting on the work on one canvas, it's in sections. I'm working on a large one at the moment. It's in 3 sections, and each section is a different size, different proportion. It splits the image, the work at a certain point that I've designed into it. Here it happens to split it down this Z and at the side of the O, the Z and the O of Zot. And this is essentially an image that's full of signs of negation, if you like, of the negative, which I'm then creating as a positive action. And what I mean by that is that, first of all of what you're looking at has been built in the studio as a positive form. So the wall was light gray. Zot, you saw before, the form was black with white spots. The yellow area was blue paint. The blue cross is timber. But if you look at all of that in negative, that's what you get. Those are the color values you get. So I'm creating, one of the things I've started to do in the studio is build environments in the positive, but to create them in a way that I'm consciously creating them in the positive, so that when I invert them, the color values, the negative version is actually the version that I want. I want that throwaway, as if the negative has value. And the playwright and writer Samuel Beckett referred to something, a quality of negative capability. So rather than a positive incapability, he indicated that negative itself can have something which is essentially positive about it, can have a capability. And for one reason or another, and we don't always know why, we choose to do things, and then we analyze why later. I'm fascinated by creating environments which are the way that we would expect the world to be, and then flipping them the other way and making the artwork from the other side. But I'm building things in the way that we would expect them to be, but with an eye on how they will appear afterwards. So all the colors are manipulated and chosen when I'm painting things and constructing things solely for the other side of it, not for how they look right there, but when they're inverted. This is full of negation because you have the symbol of the cross, the crossing out, if you like. You have a reference, in my mind anyway, to the grayness, the flatness of minimalism. And this, going back to this, the idea of Zot being a fool or an idiot, this black and white personage that sits in the studio, being there. I see many similarities between the way in which the figures operated in the earlier works and the figures became signs, if you like, within a collection of other signs, painted signs, mark making, objects, color, fabric, textures, surfaces. The work always had an aspect of being a recording and a presentation of things and objects, regardless of whether they happen to be people. I don't mean that in a way which is insulting towards people. I merely mean that as and when we focus to a greater extent upon the story behind a person, the story behind a face, for example, then we can't help ourselves. We get lost within that. And I've almost always tried to lead people to the mechanism of what it is we're looking at. And now I do that in a way which emphasizes your relationship with the picture rather than placing a figure within the picture, as I was saying earlier, basically. So that's a large part of the evolution of thinking and concept.
It just occurred to me that while you were explaining and I was going through the works again, that actually long before you started working with the sculptures, you were thinking as a sculptor. You had their perspective because you were deconstructing, reconstructing, and that's very interesting.
I would agree. I would say that. So I was trained trained as a painter, essentially. I thought of work in painting terms. I desperately wanted to be a painter. I really liked the look of the word painting and painter. It seemed to be so fantastic from when I was really young. But then when I came to make paintings, I found that I was constructing things. I was making marks and then printing them onto another surface. Or I was photographing the thing that I made and then making a work about what I'd made. So I was almost always creating some kind of distance between myself and the more simple act of just making a painting. And I do think that within that process and within that distance, there was a kind of sculptural thought process, and sometimes, and now even more so, a sculptural physicality of making. And that's changed form. And now I'm pleased to be able to reach a point where I can make things which look like sculptures.
So it, in a way, it comes to a completion.
It does.
Yeah, interesting.
And that's one of the main reasons why I titled the performance and the talk Sculptor Studio, because the space that I make within the studio, constructed walls to then place things in to generate work. I realized that I've been doing that for a long time, even if the walls were not there, conceptually there was a studio within my studio. And it's worth thinking about it as a meta studio, and I mean, I'm using the word meta in a non-Zuckerberg way. Okay? Meta as in being about something. So I believe that I make meta painting. I make painting which is about what it might be to make a painting. And I think the sculpture is a sculpture which is about the process of constructing something physically and considering what that might be, and the extent to which that needs to be permanent, the extent to which it can be fragile. When the sculpture is carried upstairs and it becomes part of the show, does it change? Is it altered? Is it more rarefied? Mm-hmm. Is it different than how it is now? And to engage with those, what would I say, dynamics of making, essentially. So this is an important part of it. Yeah.
So one last question, maybe I could ask many more questions, but I think maybe other people would have questions as well. From that one to the second one now, how do you perceive, is there a kind of progression in any way? And how would you feel about it now after, it's like your own baby, I know, when you make something. And how will you feel about it being in the show after it's done?
I was once on a radio program, a live radio program, and the interview was connected with a group show around an exhibition at the Imperial War Museum in London. And the work, I hadn't seen the work for a few years, and it was going to be in the show. And the presenter asked me, he said, so this work was made a few years ago. You're just seeing it again. How do you feel about that? How is it walking in on it? I said, well, and this show was partly to do with the truce within the First World War, when both Germans and the Allies they agreed to stop for Christmas Day and play football and exchange gifts. And I said, well, it's a little bit like going home for Christmas. And he looked at me and he said, this was the presenter, Robert Elms, and he said, how so? And I said, well, you go home, you haven't seen the family for a while, and you walk in and you think, do I still like these people? And it's a bit like that with artworks, when you still, because once you finish making them, and if you can't get your hands back on it to make changes, you have to accept how it is. And it's external to you.
Yes.
And you're related to it. Mm-hmm. And you may want to stand back and think, okay, I made you. Or maybe they look at you and go, I made you. But you made something, and it needs to be out there independently.
Yes, on its own.
In terms of it being version number 2, there was a certain freedom to this work. Mm-hmm. It's based heavily on Untitled Zot, the first one. So I was able to, I would say I was able to improvise. There's a kind of looseness to it. As I was explaining before, I was working with slightly different tools, and therefore I've altered my working practice somewhat. Well, it's been liberating. Yeah.
Sure.
Different way of
adapting.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. And maybe one last thing is about, it makes me think of Hegel's master and slave dialects, where when you start working on an object and before it becomes something, you're the master, and when you start working on it, it starts to become something, and then people start viewing it, and then it starts to say something about you as a sculptor, and when it becomes a finished sculpture, then it's, as you say, it's independent.
That's right.
And other people, now viewers, have the privilege to actually evaluate you as a sculptor through it.
Yeah,
so
this is true.
then it becomes, in a way, the master, detached from you, in a way.
If you keep work in the studio, then you're able to, let's say, arrest that process. You can stop that from happening. The moment that you exhibit things, whether or not they come back to the studio, whether they go to a new home, so to speak, they end up in someone's collection, the work is going to operate independently. Now, there are discussions around, and we were talking earlier about this, the importance of artist biography and our appreciation of artwork. Do we need to know about a certain painter and their life and the situation, the circumstances of the making? Can we, in fact, take a more formalist view, approach a work of art in a gallery without really knowing very much at all and just respond? What is it I'm looking at? I believe in both, actually. And I think that to adopt a formalist perspective, or let's say a material perspective, look and think about what's in front of you, is incredibly valuable. On the other hand, once we left the realm of representational painting and sculpture, and we moved into experimentation and modernism and avant-garde, and further late 20th century and into the 21st century, it becomes more problematic. We're not necessarily looking at something which is a mirror of our world. We're looking at an experience which is heavily mediated through developments in language. So having some knowledge and background is very, very helpful, I would say. Ultimately, the work becomes the master, because you're only really as good as the last thing you make. I mean, you can, and in that respect, you can have a high point and then other things happen, and then you'll gain a new momentum. I like to think of creative life. I think that the way that you act and the ideas that you're open to and the activities you're open to and the conversations which come about are as important as the making. I think they are integral to the making. I don't believe artwork is made only in the rarefied conditions of a studio. I think that you carry all of that around with you everywhere you go.
Sure.
Hence, the idea that the setup that we've had here for these few days can very naturally be an extension of my London studio, because almost everything that I need is, in fact, within me as a human being.
Yes, sure.
Everything else can be purchased, sourced, and then made use of. I don't know if that makes me a master, but I don't think so.
Well, thank you. So should we then address a question to the audience and ask them how they felt when they were watching you work and how they felt when they heard you speak about it? Would anyone like to make comments about that? Pınar, what do you think?
Thank you very much to you for sharing your ideas with us. While watching you, first I concentrated on what could the sculpture might mean, and I tried to find some symbolizations. And then I focused on your work and how you work with the objects. And actually, when you talked about your work's evolution through years, I now understand that there was a transition between your sculpture studio and the audience, and we watched through it, and then it was first the sculpture studio and the audience, but then with the transition in between, it became something else. It became an event, and I think if I asked anyone in the audience, they would tell lots of things about their ideas, and they will all be unique and different. And I felt that interaction very well, and it's a great experience. Thank you very much for considering this event.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear your response because it indicates a level of participation, anticipation of what might be happening, an interpretation that what meaning might there be attached to a certain action. I change something, I'm doing that as naturally as I can. And I haven't worked in a public way before at all. I certainly didn't mean to cause any offense by not engaging with you when you were watching. But I decided that that would be rather off-putting for everyone. That it was better for me to do the thing that I was doing, and then we would talk later, talk now. However, even though I was not talking or looking at you in the audience, I did feel, of course I felt your eyes upon me and the potential thoughts about what I might do next. And so there was one could say there was the beginnings of a kind of symbiotic relationship. Did I change anything that I did in relation to? I don't know. It's possible. It's possible. So there's potentially an indication of the fragility of my will and my intention. There's always a possibility that when we're being watched, we change the nature of what we do. I don't mind that. I don't mind it. I've spent sufficient time making work with the studio door closed, the isolation of the studio. So to have this kind of to and fro, even though everybody was silent and nobody said, no, to the left, to the right, don't do that, put it down. Nobody made those comments. I mean, I wouldn't have minded. But there was an unspoken dialogue, I think. So I'm very happy to hear your response. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Anything?
I was just wondering if our presence now thought it affected you and that was the first thing you answered. So it was strange for me.
I must say that I didn't know until a few minutes before that you would be seated inside and then the doors would be open, the blinds would come up and the doors would be open. As soon as I realized that, I thought, what a fantastic idea, because it's like cinema. Like, you get to sit and I'm doing that thing. And so I was very grateful for that. Because it felt, it had the right level of theatricality, I think, I would say. And there's also a level of formality because you were seated. So there was a very obvious delineation between those who were viewing, and then a shallow space, and then the making space, this constructed sculpture studio. So I like that relationship very much, spatially and conceptually. We're all self-conscious to a lesser or greater extent. I don't think I'm self-conscious in terms of, the movements that I make, the way that I behave. I can control that, but I can't control the way in which anybody else perceives that and interprets it. So, of course, I try and behave well as a human being. But when I was making the sculpture, I did have a thought that I might be quite amusing, that moving around, picking things up and moving them around might have a slightly, almost a comedic quality to it. And certainly over time, if you're watching that happen, often when I'm in the studio myself, I think, wow, if somebody was to watch me, I must look quite insane. You know, going back over to look at something, changing it, sipping some coffee. Oh, it's cold, put it back, start something else. Look at your phone, go back to the work. And so in essence, I was just doing that, but in front of people. I mean, I might wake up in the middle of the night, you know, shocked, sweating, but so far I feel pretty good about it, actually. So, and I'm really grateful for your patience and sitting and watching and then allowing me to explain some of this through conversation with Billur. As I was saying at the beginning, when you've been making work, you know, professionally for more than 20 years, it's not easy to try to condense some of those concepts and ideas and movements and shifts. You want to communicate in the best way that you can. So I very much hope that I've managed to do something of that. And thank you for your, I'm really grateful for your participation. It was super important. Yeah?
Thank you.
My pleasure.